The desert wind whipped across the makeshift airfield as Major Sarah Chun adjusted her flight suit for the third time that morning. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a sleeping beast, its distinctive twin engines and armored cockpit gleaming under the harsh Afghan sun. Around her, Navy SEALs prepared their gear with a methodical precision that had kept them alive through countless missions in hostile territory. Commander Jake Morrison approached her with a grimace that had become all too familiar over the past week. His weathered face showed the strain of leading Alpha Team through some of the most dangerous operations in the region. Behind him, his team of 8 elite operators stood in a loose circle, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly doubtful. "Major, with all due respect," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of combat. "What you're proposing is suicide. We've had 3 different pilots tell us it can't be done. The terrain is impossible, the altitude requirements are beyond the A-10's capabilities, and the enemy presence in that valley is unlike anything we've seen before." Sarah had heard this argument before. The mission briefing had been clear. A high-value terrorist leader was meeting with foreign weapons suppliers in a heavily fortified compound nestled deep in a mountain valley. The location was surrounded by towering peaks, with only one narrow approach that required flying at an altitude so low that traditional air support was deemed impossible. The valley walls rose nearly vertical on both sides, creating what military strategists called a death funnel for any aircraft attempting to provide close air support. Previous reconnaissance missions had confirmed the worst fears of military planners. The compound was protected by multiple anti-aircraft positions, strategically placed to create overlapping fields of fire. Any aircraft entering the valley would be flying directly into a carefully orchestrated trap, with no room for evasive maneuvers and no escape route if things went wrong. "Commander, I understand your concerns," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "But I've studied the terrain maps, analyzed the weather patterns, and calculated the flight path down to the second. The A-10 wasn't designed for this kind of precision flying, but it's the only aircraft that can survive what we're going to face down there." The mission had become personal for everyone involved. Intelligence reports indicated that the terrorist leader, known only as the Engineer, was responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of American soldiers over the past year. His expertise in improvised explosive devices had made him one of the most wanted men in the region, and this meeting represented the best opportunity to eliminate him before he could disappear again into the vast network of caves and safe houses that honeycombed the mountains. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, stepped forward. Her normally confident demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty as she spoke. "Ma'am, we've lost good people trying to get to this guy. The last team that attempted a ground assault never made it within 5 miles of the target. They were picked off one by snipers positioned throughout the valley approaches. The weight of previous failures hung heavy in the air. 3 separate ground operations had ended in disaster, with entire teams either killed or forced to retreat under heavy fire. The compound's location made it virtually impregnable to conventional assault, protected by both natural barriers and a sophisticated network of defensive positions that had been years in the making." Sarah walked slowly around her aircraft, running her hand along the reinforced titanium armor that protected the cockpit and vital systems. The A-10 had been designed as a tank killer, built to survive ground fire and deliver devastating close air support to troops in contact. Its reputation for toughness was legendary, but what she was proposing would push both machine and pilot beyond their intended limits. "The valley floor is only 200 feet wide at the narrowest point," she explained, pointing to the aerial photographs spread across a portable table. "The compound sits on a small plateau about halfway through the valley, protected by sheer rock walls on 3 sides. The only way to get a clear shot is to fly the entire length of the valley at an altitude that puts us below the ridgeline." The SEALs exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had trained for impossible missions, but This one seemed to defy not just military doctrine, but basic physics. The margin for error was non-existent, and failure would mean not just the loss of another pilot, but the continuation of terrorist activities that were costing American lives on a daily basis. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah knew that time was running out. Intelligence had confirmed that the meeting would take place within the next 48 hours, and weather forecasts showed a storm system approaching that would make flying impossible for at least a week. This was their window, and it was closing fast. The mission planning room buzzed with tension as Sarah spread out detailed topographical maps across the metal table. Colonel Davis, the base commander, stood at the head of the room, his expression grave as he studied the intelligence reports that had been filtering in throughout the morning. The latest satellite imagery showed increased activity around the compound, confirming that the meeting was definitely going to take place. Major Chun, Colonel Davis began, his voice carrying the weight of command, I need you to understand what you're asking us to approve. This isn't just about flying low or dealing with enemy fire. You're talking about threading a needle at 300 miles per hour, with mountain peaks on both sides that could tear your wings off if you drift even a few feet off course. Sarah had spent the previous night running calculations, studying every detail of the terrain and weather conditions. The valley's unique geography created wind patterns that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. Downdrafts from surrounding peaks could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning, while updrafts near the valley walls could send a plane careening into solid rock. Commander Morrison pointed to a section of the map where previous missions had failed. Right here, at this choke point, we lost Lieutenant Jackson's F-16 2 months ago. The wreckage is still scattered across the valley floor. The anti-aircraft positions are concentrated here, and here. He indicated 3 positions with red markers. They've got overlapping fields of fire that cover every possible approach angle. The intelligence officer, Captain Williams, added his own concerns to the growing list of obstacles. Sir, the latest reports show they've brought in additional surface-to-air missiles. We're looking at a minimum of 6 confirmed SAM sites, plus an unknown number of man-portable systems. They're expecting us. Sarah stood and walked to the large-scale map mounted on the wall. Her finger traced the proposed flight path, a serpentine route that would take her through the valley at an altitude that seemed impossibly low. The key is speed and surprise, she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she outlined her strategy. The A-10's armor can take hits that would down other aircraft. We go in fast, stay below their radar horizon, and use the valley walls for protection. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution requirements. Sarah would approach the valley from the east, using a series of smaller canyons to mask her approach until the last possible moment. At the valley entrance, she would drop to an altitude of less than 100 feet above the valley floor, flying a precise course that would keep her below the sight lines of most defensive positions. Chief Petty Officer Tom Bradley, the team's explosives expert, raised a concern that had been troubling the entire SEAL team. Ma'am, even if you make it to the target and deliver your ordnance, how do you plan to get out? The valley is a dead end. Once you reach the compound, you'll have to reverse course and fly back through the same gauntlet of defensive fire. It was a valid question that had kept Sarah awake for most of the night. Traditional escape routes were impossible given the terrain. The valley walls were too high to climb over quickly, and turning around in the narrow confines would expose her aircraft to devastating fire from multiple directions. Her solution was as unconventional as the rest of the mission. I'm not turning around, Sarah announced, causing a stir among the assembled military personnel. The valley continues for another 2 miles past the compound before it opens up into the main drainage. It's never been mapped for military operations because no one thought an aircraft could fly through it, but satellite imagery shows it's just wide enough for the A-10's wingspan. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. She was proposing to fly through unmapped terrain, following a river valley that might contain any number of natural or man-made obstacles. There would be no reconnaissance, no detailed planning for this portion of the flight. She would be flying blind through unknown territory, trusting her skills and the aircraft durability to see her through. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, the intelligence liaison, pulled up additional satellite images on his laptop. Major, these images are 6 months old, and the resolution isn't good enough to show obstacles like power lines, radio towers, or bridge structures. You could be flying to a dead end or straight into a mountainside. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the risks while maintaining her resolve. The alternative is letting the engineer escape again. Intelligence says this is our best shot at him for the foreseeable future. Every day he's free, more American soldiers die from his devices. The personal stakes were clear to everyone in the room. The engineer's latest innovations had made roadside bombs significantly more deadly and harder to detect. His capture or elimination could save hundreds of lives in the coming months, but only if they could reach him in his heavily defended stronghold. Master Sergeant Kelly O'Brien, the team's senior NCO, spoke up from the back of the room. "Ma'am, what's your confidence level? In all honesty, what do you think your chances are of making it through this alive?" Sarah paused, considering her answer carefully. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Too many variables, too many things that could go wrong, too many ways to die in the span of a few minutes. But she had trained her entire career for missions exactly like this one, and the A-10 had been built to survive in the most hostile environments imaginable. 60%, she answered honestly. Maybe 70, if everything goes according to plan. The silence that followed was deafening. Dawn broke over the Afghan mountains as Sarah completed her final pre-flight inspection of the A-10. The aircraft had been loaded with a specialized payload designed specifically for this mission. Precision-guided munitions that could penetrate the reinforced structures of the compound while minimizing collateral damage to surrounding areas. Every system had been checked and double-checked, every possible contingency plan for as much as circumstances would allow. The SEAL team gathered around the aircraft as Sarah climbed into the cockpit. Despite their earlier reservations, these men had come to respect her determination and skill. Commander Morrison approached the aircraft and handed her a small radio transponder. "This is connected directly to our communications network," he explained. "If you make it through, we'll be monitoring your approach and can provide real-time intelligence updates." The weight of the mission settled on Sarah's shoulders as she strapped herself into the armored cockpit. Through the canopy, she could see the distant mountains that held her target, their peaks shrouded in morning mist that would provide additional cover for her approach. Weather conditions were as favorable as they were likely to get, with clear skies and minimal wind at altitude. Engine startup proceeded normally, the twin turbofans spooling up with their characteristic whine. Sarah ran through her checklist methodically, knowing that any oversight could be fatal in the unforgiving environment she was about to enter. The A-10's systems responded perfectly, all indicators showing green as she prepared for takeoff. The flight to the valley entrance took 45 minutes, during which Sarah reviewed her planned route one final time. GPS coordinates had been programmed into the aircraft's navigation system, but she knew that once she entered the valley, she would be flying primarily by visual reference. The narrow confines would make instrument navigation nearly impossible, requiring the kind of seat-of-the-pants flying that separated true pilots from mere aircraft operators. As the valley entrance appeared ahead, Sarah felt her heart rate increase despite her years of training and combat experience. The opening in a mountainside looked impossibly small from her current altitude, like a crack in a massive stone wall. According to her calculations, she would have less than 30 seconds from the time she committed to the approach until she was either through the entrance or dead. "Control, this is Thunderbolt 7, she radioed to the command center. "Beginning final approach to target area. All systems nominal." "Roger, Thunderbolt 7, came the reply from Colonel Davis. "Weather stations report winds holding steady. You are cleared for attack run at your discretion." Sarah pushed the throttles forward and pointed the A-10's nose toward the valley entrance. The aircraft responded immediately, acceleration pressing her back in her seat as the mountainsides began to blur past her cockpit windows. At this speed, there would be no second chances and no room for hesitation. The valley walls rose up around her like the jaws of some enormous predator, blocking out the sky and channeling her into the narrow corridor that led to the target. Sarah's hands moved constantly on the flight controls, making minute adjustments to keep the aircraft centered in the increasingly narrow space. The sound of the engines echoed off the rock walls, creating a thunderous roar that announced her presence to anyone within miles. Ahead, she could see the first of the anti-aircraft positions that intelligence had identified. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed emplacements as enemy gunners opened fire, streams of tracer rounds creating deadly patterns of light in the confined space of the valley. The A-10 shuddered as rounds struck the armored hull, but the aircraft's legendary toughness allowed it to continue flying despite taking multiple hits. Sarah rolled the aircraft slightly to present a smaller target profile while maintaining her precise course through the valley. The margin for error was measured in inches rather than feet, with the rocky walls just beyond her wingtips serving as a constant reminder of the consequences of even the smallest mistake. Through her headset, she could hear the voices of the SEAL team monitoring her progress, their tension evident even through the static of long-range radio communication. The compound appeared ahead, exactly where intelligence reports had predicted. Sarah could see vehicles parked in the central courtyard and figures running for cover as the sound of her approach reached them. This was the moment she had trained for, the culmination of years of preparation and months of planning. Her targeting system locked onto the primary building, and she prepared to release her weapons. But as she lined up for the attack run, something went wrong. The aircraft suddenly lurched to the right, driven by a powerful downdraft that slammed her toward the valley wall with tremendous force. Sarah fought the controls desperately, using every ounce of her skill and strength to keep the A-10 from cartwheeling into the mountainside. The aircraft's engines screamed as she applied maximum power, clawing for altitude and control in the turbulent air. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel as systems strained beyond their design limits. The aircraft had taken more damage from ground fire than initially apparent, and the stress of the extreme flying conditions was beginning to take its toll on both machine and pilot. Hydraulic pressure was dropping in one of the flight control systems, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to handle in the challenging environment of the valley. Despite the growing list of problems, Sarah managed to regain control just in time to acquire her target. The compound filled her targeting display, and she could see the specific building that housed the engineer and his associates. Her finger found the weapon release button, and she prepared to complete the mission that had brought her through this aerial nightmare. The weapons released cleanly from their pylons, guided toward their target by sophisticated electronics that had been programmed with the exact coordinates of the compound. Sarah watched through her targeting pod as the precision munitions streaked toward their destination, carrying with them the hopes of countless soldiers who had suffered under the engineer's deadly innovations. The explosions erupted behind Sarah as her weapons found their targets, sending shockwaves through the valley that she could feel even through the armored cockpit of her aircraft. Through her rearview mirrors, she watched as the compound disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris, but there was no time to assess the damage. Her aircraft was severely wounded, and she was flying deeper into unmapped territory with each passing second. The hydraulic warning lights continued to flash ominously as Sarah struggled to maintain control of the A-10. The aircraft wanted to roll to the right, requiring constant pressure on the flight controls to keep it flying straight and level. Worse, the valley ahead was narrowing even further, and she could see rapids in the river below, indicating that the terrain was becoming increasingly treacherous. Thunderbolt 7, this is Control. Colonel Davis's voice crackled through her headset. We show weapons impact on target. What's your status? Control, Thunderbolt 7, Sarah replied, her voice strained with the effort of controlling the damaged aircraft. Target destroyed, continuing through the valley. Aircraft is damaged, but flyable. Hydraulics degraded, handling difficult. Behind her, the compound continued to burn, but intelligence analysts monitoring the strike through satellite imagery were already confirming what Sarah had hoped to hear. Thermal signatures indicated that the primary target building had been completely destroyed, and there were no signs of survivors attempting to flee the area. The engineers' reign of terror appeared to be over. But Sarah's ordeal was far from finished. The valley ahead twisted and turned like a serpent, forcing her to bank the aircraft sharply to follow its course. Each turn put enormous stress on the damaged flight control systems, and she could feel the A-10 becoming less responsive with each maneuver. The river below had carved a path through solid rock over millions of years, creating a natural corridor that was just barely wide enough for her aircraft. As she rounded a particularly sharp bend, Sarah was horrified to see a new obstacle ahead, a narrow bridge spanning the valley, its cables and support structures directly in her flight path. The bridge was old and appeared to be used primarily by local villagers, but its location made it a deadly trap for any aircraft flying through the valley at low altitude. There was no time to climb over the bridge and no room to fly around it. Sarah had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. The bridge's main span was approximately 50 feet above the river, while the support cables extended much higher into the airspace she needed to traverse. Making a split-second calculation, Sarah pushed the aircraft into a steep dive, aiming to pass under the bridge's main span. The maneuver was incredibly dangerous given her aircraft's damaged condition, but it was the only option available. The A-10 dropped like a stone toward the rushing water below, its engines screaming as she fought to control the descent. The bridge flashed overhead with just feet to spare, the aircraft's vertical stabilizer nearly clipping the ancient stone supports. Sarah pulled back on the controls with all her strength, forcing the wounded aircraft to climb back to a safe altitude as the valley walls continued to close in around her. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool air at altitude, and her hands were cramping from the constant struggle to keep the A-10 under control. "Jesus Christ," came a voice over the radio that Sarah recognized as belonging to Master Sergeant O'Brien. Did she just fly under that bridge? The SEAL team was monitoring her progress through a combination of satellite imagery and radio communications, witnessing firsthand the incredible display of flying skill required to navigate the treacherous valley. None of them had believed it was possible when a mission was first proposed, but Sarah was proving that exceptional pilots could push the boundaries of what was considered feasible. The valley began to widen slightly as Sarah continued her escape route, but new challenges appeared with each mile. The river below was joined by tributaries that carved their own channels through the landscape, creating a maze of rocky outcroppings and sudden elevation changes that required constant vigilance to avoid. Her fuel gauges showed that consumption was higher than normal due to the damaged systems and the extreme flying conditions. Ahead, Sarah could see what appeared to be the end of the valley system, where it opened into a broader plain that would allow her to climb to a safer altitude. But between her current position and that salvation lay the most challenging section yet, a series of rapids where the river dropped hundreds of feet through a narrow gorge, creating powerful downdrafts and unpredictable wind patterns. The A-10's engines coughed momentarily as she entered the turbulent air above the rapids, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Any engine failure at this point would be catastrophic, as there was no suitable terrain for an emergency landing within dozens of miles. She reduced power slightly to decrease the stress on the engines, while maintaining just enough speed to keep control of the aircraft. Rock walls flashed past on both sides as the valley made one final attempt to claim her aircraft. Sarah could see scratches on her wingtips, where she had come dangerously close to contact with the stone surfaces, but the A-10's rugged construction had protected her from serious damage. The aircraft was living up to its reputation as one of the most survivable combat aircraft ever built. As the valley finally began to open up ahead, Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. She had accomplished what everyone said was impossible, destroying a high-value target in a heavily defended location and escaping through terrain that had never been flown by military aircraft. But the mission wasn't complete until she was safely on the ground, and her aircraft's condition was deteriorating with each passing minute. The radio crackled with voices from the command center as word of the successful mission spread throughout the base. Intelligence analysts were confirming the complete destruction of the compound and the elimination of the engineer, while search and rescue teams were being positioned along her projected flight path in case emergency landing became necessary. The broader valley ahead offered Sarah her first opportunity to climb to a safer altitude in nearly 20 minutes of harrowing low-level flight. As the A-10 clawed its way skyward, she finally had a chance to assess the full extent of the damage her aircraft had sustained during the mission. The news was not encouraging. Multiple warning lights illuminated her instrument panel like a deadly constellation, indicating problems with hydraulic systems, electrical components, and engine performance. Fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to the damaged systems and the extreme flying conditions, leaving her with barely enough reserves to reach the nearest friendly airfield. The aircraft was flying, but just barely. Control, Thunderbolt 7, Sarah radioed as she reached 5,000 feet altitude. Mission complete, target destroyed. Aircraft heavily damaged, declaring emergency. Request vectors to nearest suitable runway, and emergency services standing by. Roger, Thunderbolt 7. Colonel Davis responded immediately. Outstanding work. Vector 270 degrees to forward operating base Delta, distance 42 miles. Emergency crews are being notified and will be standing by for your arrival. The flight to the emergency airfield would normally have taken less than 15 minutes, but Sarah's damaged aircraft was struggling to maintain even basic flight parameters. The hydraulic failures made the controls increasingly heavy and unresponsive, requiring constant attention to keep the A-10 flying straight and level. She could feel the aircraft wanting to depart controlled flight with each passing minute. Halfway to the airfield, disaster struck. One of the engines began to lose power, its exhaust gas temperature climbing rapidly toward dangerous levels. Sarah had no choice but to shut down the failing engine, leaving her with only one power plant to maintain flight in an aircraft that was never designed for single-engine operation in its current condition. Control, Thunderbolt 7, she called urgently. I've lost my left engine. Single-engine approach, emergency landing. Estimate touchdown in 8 minutes. The control tower at forward operating base Delta erupted in activity as emergency crews scrambled to prepare for Sarah's arrival. Fire trucks and ambulances positioned themselves along the runway, while flight surgeons prepared for the possibility of serious injuries. The base commander cleared all other air traffic from the area, giving Sarah priority for landing. Flying on one engine in a heavily damaged aircraft, Sarah had to use every skill she had developed over years of training and combat flying. The A-10 wanted to yaw violently due to the asymmetric thrust, and the damaged flight controls made compensation difficult and exhausting. Sweat stung her eyes as she fought to line up with the distant runway. Commander Morrison and his SEAL team had driven to the airfield to witness Sarah's return, their earlier skepticism replaced by profound respect for what she had accomplished. They watched through binoculars as the wounded A-10 appeared in the distance, trailing smoke from its damaged engine, and flying an approach that was clearly unstable. She's too low, Master Sergeant O'Brien observed, his voice tight with concern. At that approach angle, and with only one engine, she's not going to make the runway. Sarah was fighting the same battle, trying to coax just a few more feet of altitude from her failing aircraft, while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid a stall. The runway appeared ahead like a narrow strip of salvation, but it was going to be close. Very close. The A-10 crossed the runway threshold with just inches to spare, its landing gear barely clearing the approach lights. Sarah flared the aircraft for touchdown, but the damaged flight controls responded sluggishly, causing the aircraft to hit the runway hard and bounce back into the air. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that the aircraft would cartwheel down the runway, but Sarah's skill and the A-10's rugged construction combined to keep it upright. The aircraft touched down a second time and stayed on the ground, but Sarah's ordeal wasn't over. The damaged hydraulic systems made braking nearly impossible, and the runway was rushing past at dangerous speed. She deployed the aircraft's drag chute and applied what little braking power remained, watching helplessly as the end of the runway approached rapidly. With less than 500 feet of runway remaining, the A-10 finally came to a stop, smoke pouring from its overheated brakes and damaged engine. Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment, hardly believing that she had survived the mission. Through her canopy, she could see emergency vehicles racing toward her position, their lights flashing in the bright afternoon sun. As she climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs, the SEAL team was among the first to reach her aircraft. Commander Morrison looked up at the damage covering the A-10's hull and shook his head in amazement. "Major, I owe you an apology," he said, extending his hand. "What you did today was impossible, and you did it anyway." The intelligence reports that came in over the following hours confirmed the complete success of the mission. The engineer was dead, along with 3 foreign weapon suppliers who had been meeting with him to arrange shipments of advanced explosive components. The compound had been completely destroyed, eliminating a major terrorist training facility and weapons cache. More importantly, the ripple effects of the successful mission were felt throughout the region. The engineer's network of bomb makers began to fall apart without his leadership and technical expertise, leading to a dramatic decrease in roadside bomb attacks over the following months. Dozens of American soldiers would return home safely because of what Sarah had accomplished in those terrifying minutes above the Afghan mountains. Sarah stood beside her damaged aircraft as the sun set over the airfield, watching maintenance crews assess the extent of the damage. The A-10 would fly again after extensive repairs, but it would bear the scars of this mission for the rest of its service life. Like its pilot, it had been tested beyond all reasonable limits and had emerged victorious. The mission that everyone said was impossible had become a legend that would be told in military aviation circles for years to come. Sarah Chun had proven that exceptional skill, unwavering determination, and unshakable courage could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The SEALs had been wrong about what was possible, and she had been proud to prove it to them. The desert wind whipped across the makeshift airfield as Major Sarah Chun adjusted her flight suit for the 3rd time that morning. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a sleeping beast, its distinctive twin engines and armored cockpit gleaming under the harsh Afghan sun. Around her, Navy SEALs prepared their gear with a methodical precision that had kept them alive through countless missions in hostile territory. Commander Jake Morrison approached her with a grimace that had become all too familiar over the past week. His weathered face showed the strain of leading Alpha Team through some of the most dangerous operations in the region. Behind him, his team of 8 elite operators stood in a loose circle, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly doubtful. "Major, with all due respect," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of combat. "What you're proposing is suicide. We've had 3 different pilots tell us it can't be done. The terrain is impossible, the altitude requirements are beyond the A-10's capabilities, and the enemy presence in that valley is unlike anything we've seen before." Sarah had heard this argument before. The mission briefing had been clear. A high-value terrorist leader was meeting with foreign weapon suppliers in a heavily fortified compound nestled deep in a mountain valley. The location was surrounded by towering peaks, with only one narrow approach that required flying at an altitude so low that traditional air support was deemed impossible. The valley walls rose nearly vertical on both sides, creating what military strategists called a death funnel for any aircraft attempting to provide close air support. Previous reconnaissance missions had confirmed the worst fears of military planners. The compound was protected by multiple anti-aircraft positions, strategically placed to create overlapping fields of fire. Any aircraft entering the valley would be flying directly into a carefully orchestrated trap, with no room for evasive maneuvers and no escape route if things went wrong. "Commander, I understand your concerns," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "But I've studied the terrain maps, analyzed the weather patterns, and calculated the flight path down to the second. The A-10 wasn't designed for this kind of precision flying, but it's the only aircraft that can survive what we're going to face down there." The mission had become personal for everyone involved. Intelligence reports indicated that the terrorist leader, known only as the Engineer, was responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of American soldiers over the past year. His expertise in improvised explosive devices had made him one of the most wanted men in the region, and this meeting represented the best opportunity to eliminate him before he could disappear again into the vast network of caves and safe houses that honeycombed the mountains. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, stepped forward. Her normally confident demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty as she spoke. "Ma'am, we've lost good people trying to get to this guy. The last team that attempted a ground assault never made it within 5 miles of the target. They were picked off one by snipers positioned throughout the valley approaches. The weight of previous failures hung heavy in the air. 3 separate ground operations had ended in disaster, with entire teams either killed or forced to retreat under heavy fire. The compound's location made it virtually impregnable to conventional assault, protected by both natural barriers and a sophisticated network of defensive positions that had been years in the making." Sarah walked slowly around her aircraft, running her hand along the reinforced titanium armor that protected the cockpit and vital systems. The A-10 had been designed as a tank killer, built to survive ground fire, and delivered devastating close air support to troops in contact. Its reputation for toughness was legendary, but what she was proposing would push both machine and pilot beyond their intended limits. "The valley floor is only 200 feet wide at the narrowest point," she explained, pointing to the aerial photographs spread across a portable table. "The compound sits on a small plateau about halfway through the valley, protected by sheer rock walls on 3 sides. The only way to get a clear shot is to fly the entire length of the valley at an altitude that puts us below the ridgeline." The SEALs exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had trained for impossible missions, but this one seemed to defy not just military doctrine, but basic physics. The margin for error was non-existent, and failure would mean not just the loss of another pilot, but the continuation of terrorist activities that were costing American lives on a daily basis. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah knew that time was running out. Intelligence had confirmed that the meeting would take place within the next 48 hours, and weather forecasts showed a storm system approaching that would make flying impossible for at least a week. This was their window, and it was closing fast.